The Ford Thunderbird began life in 1955 as a sports car, similar to the Chevrolet Corvette that was introduced for the 1953 model year. However, its life as a two-place sporty vehicle was relatively short-lived, and after the 1955, 1956, and 1957 model years, the Thunderbird expanded to be a four-place car with the so-called Square Bird that was introduced in 1958. However, despite losing its overall sporty flair, at least from a two-place perspective, the Thunderbird generally became a sales success and for many years was seen as Ford's top-of-the-line kind of sporty luxury vehicle. However, by the time the Glamour Bird was being introduced in 1967, product planners at Ford were really looking in the rearview mirror at previous General Motors offerings and kind of left wondering if the Thunderbird should trend in a larger direction. After all, the Olds Tornado, Buick Riviera, and Cadillac Eldorado were all a bit bigger vehicles and were relatively successful in the marketplace. Ford product planners no doubt were thinking that perhaps their own Thunderbird should evolve into more of a personal luxury coupe and grow larger so that it could attack a larger section of the marketplace. As a consequence, the so-called Glamour Bird that would be introduced for 1967 was more refined, larger, quieter, and also, frankly, drove better than any of its predecessors. It also marked Thunderbird's return to a full frame underneath the vehicle, and Ford employed a very interesting approach with a super rigid body riding atop a frame that was mounted to the body only in points ahead of as well as aft of the passenger compartment. It was a wonderful concept that worked perfectly in practice, endowing these Thunderbirds with a wonderful, luxurious, and very isolated ride, similar to what Ford had introduced for its 1965 full-size lineup. And overall, this type of frame and body philosophy would continue across a number of other Fords in the subsequent years. As an example, the Continental would employ a similar approach when it was introduced in 1970 and went from being unibody to framed yet again, and also the Torino would employ a similar approach when it was introduced for the 1972 model year. The overall frame and body philosophy, one might argue, was birthed because of what Pontiac did when it introduced its 1961 Pontiacs. And in that case, those Pontiacs had a quite rigid body that was mounted on a relatively flexible perimeter frame. This type of overall philosophy promised unibody strength, but also sound isolation. And Ford, to some degree, effectively copied that Pontiac philosophy. It wouldn't be the first time, however, that Ford would copy Pontiac, and the Glamour Bird would actually get some Pontiac flares for the 1970 model year that, unfortunately, I believe, didn't endow it with, let's say, the most stunning looks that it otherwise could have. Take a look at this 1967 Thunderbird in the front end, and you'll notice it has just a beautiful, distinctive front end that's devoid of any bird beaks or points. It's a flat grille with an overall egg crate pattern and designed to make the car, frankly, look quite wide. Even that Thunderbird logo in the middle of the grille is designed to emphasize the vehicle's width, and of course, the fender forms actually make the car look even larger with that kind of bulge out that you see from the dead-on front view that accentuates the car's overall width. And interestingly, it was perhaps its overall good looks that gave the 1967 Thunderbird an opportunity to outsell most all of its competition, at least from General Motors. The 67 Thunderbird sold 78,000 units compared to 43,000 units for the Buick Riviera, 18,000 units for the Cadillac Eldorado, 22,000 units for the Oldsmobile Tornado, and 43,000 units for the Pontiac Grand Prix. However, despite the Thunderbird's relative sales success in 1967, and by the way, which continued on into 1968, when the Thunderbird again outsold all those vehicles, selling about 65,000 units compared to 50,000 for the Riviera, 25,000 for the Eldorado, 26,000 for the Tornado, and 32,000 for the Grand Prix, Ford decided to go in an increasingly General Motors-y direction, if you will, on the Glamour Bird. And there was a principal reason for this. That was that Ford's chairman, Henry Ford II, at the time, decided to hire away a key executive from General Motors named Simeon or Bunky Knudsen, who was formerly the head of Pontiac Division, as well as later Chevrolet Division. And at the time, he was poached by Henry Ford II, was in charge of overseas operations. And Henry Ford II thought that he needed a very senior executive who could effectively serve as his number two, while he could, let's say, just take on more responsibilities outside of the company. Apparently, Henry Ford II didn't feel that Lee Iacocca was ready at the time, and hence poached Bunky Knudsen in 1968. When Bunky arrived, as I mentioned, he was previously Pontiac's general manager and in fact had introduced the Pontiac Grand Prix really as a response to the Ford Thunderbird. And he did so in 1962 when he was the leader of the Pontiac division. However, by this point in time when Knudsen joined Ford, he thought that for whatever reason, the Thunderbird should emulate more of the Pontiac Grand Prix styling. And of course, at this point, the Pontiac Grand Prix was getting an increasingly pronounced beak that you saw not only in some of the earlier model years, like the 1963 Grand Prix, but it kind of got increasingly more aquiline as the years went on, especially by the time 1969 rolled around. As a consequence, Bunky was the one who actually ordered Ford designers to redo the front end of the 1970 Thunderbird and put this pronounced beak-like form on the front of it. And I think it's really just an unfortunate styling choice because, especially in sport coupe form, the 1970 Thunderbird and the 71 Thunderbird are absolutely beautiful automobiles. They ride great, they drive great, they look great, especially from the rear three-quarter view. But as you rotate around to the front, that bird beak really comes into view, especially on the dead-on side profile of the car. And it just doesn't quite look right, especially when you contrast it against the 1967 and 8 and 9 Thunderbirds that really have, I think, frankly, a nice front end associated with them. In any event, that's what Bunky wanted. The designers were not happy, but they accommodated his, let's call it, mandate, which they really didn't have any choice. And so the Thunderbird became endowed with this Pontiac-like form. Interestingly, Bunky also dictated a similar form on the front of the 1971 LTD, and consequently, it also got this pointy nose. Now, as part of the story, Bunky was hired by Ford in 1968, but by the end of 1969, he was already fired. And in fact, what really happened here is Lee Iacocca himself, as well as other allies of Lee Iacocca's behind the scenes, ended up really just engineering Bunky's exit. In fact, it's alleged that Iacocca at one point approached Henry Ford II and said that if he didn't get rid of Bunky Knudsen, then all these people that were key executives at Ford were going to leave en masse at the same time. And apparently, Henry Ford II acquiesced and fired Bunky Knudsen. So while Knudsen was gone, Henry Ford II didn't, interestingly, appoint Iacocca to be the president of the Ford Motor Company for some time after that. The position was left vacant, and I guess Henry Ford was just trying to test Iacocca out to see if he was the one who could actually fill the appropriate shoes of the president of the Ford Motor Company. He did eventually get the appointment, but he was also let go in 1978 in kind of similar circumstances where allegedly Henry Ford told him that he was being let go simply because, quote, "I just don't like you, Lee." It's an interesting way to go. And of course, Iacocca would later go on to lead the Chrysler Corporation, especially through its near bankruptcy chapter, and would work with the government on the bailout of Chrysler, etc., and lead Chrysler for many years to come. But in any case, I think it's interesting to think about the history of the 70 and 71 Thunderbird in particular, and that is that Bunky Knudsen, when he was at General Motors and the Pontiac general manager, actually launched the Grand Prix as a response to the Thunderbird. Then when he's brought over to Ford, he tells the stylist that he wants the Thunderbird to look more like the Grand Prix and put this beak on it, and do the same really for the 71 and 72 LTD. Of course, as soon as Bunky left, the kind of snout, if you will, the Thunderbird as well as the LTD evaporated. And by 1972, when the Thunderbird was redesigned, it was gone and it had more of a flat front. And for 1973, the LTD's front was redesigned and that beak was really lost. So Bunky was an interesting fellow, and his influence on the Ford Motor Company styling included what I just mentioned. And he was also arguably responsible for increasing the size of the Mustang and making it significantly larger. In fact, Bunky hired a prominent General Motors stylist named Larry Shinoda from General Motors, brought him to Ford, and Shinoda was really responsible for that expanding Mustang and making it a bigger car because they thought that that was the right direction for the vehicle to head. One could say, well, at least argue one way or the other if that was the right direction. In any case, the Bird Beak really didn't do anything for Thunderbird sales. They remained flat year over year in 1970 versus 1969. Although, strangely, by this point, the 1969 Grand Prix had been introduced, and the Grand Prix sales just took off as a result. In 1969, Thunderbird sold about 50,000 units. Grand Prix sold 112,000 units, so more than double Thunderbird. In 1970, when the Bird Beak Thunderbird would come about, Ford sold 50,000, again Thunderbirds. Pontiac's Grand Prix, it had tapered off in sales a bit, but still sold 66,000 units. And the Grand Prix would continue to outsell the Thunderbird in some of the coming years as well. So didn't quite work out, perhaps, as Bunky had envisioned, but nonetheless, the 1970 and 71 Thunderbirds are great cars to drive if you could just get over that, well, let's just call it an interesting aquiline front end. Let's listen in to this dialogue of then Ford styling executive Don De La Rosa talking about his interaction with Bunky Knudsen and his thoughts on this Bird Beak Thunderbird that he and his team effectively had to graft onto the Thunderbird. Don De La Rosa would later go on to become Chrysler's lead of styling under Lee Iacocca, who brought him from Ford. Let's listen in.
Knudsen caused some design decisions that were, I thought, were very unfortunate on our, particularly on, we had some cars that were, the timing of the design process was such that they were easy to fall victim to his influence, and it caused us to put a peculiar looking front end on the Thunderbird and so forth, and it was an effort on his part to, I recalling him telling us that, it was, should look like a Pontiac. I thought that was kind of honest and strange.
He had just come from Pontiac.
Yeah, so he thought that, it should look like a Pontiac. That was what was wrong with us, so we didn't know how to do that. So he caused a very strange-looking front to get on the Thunderbird.
Let's now close out with a commercial from 1970 featuring the Thunderbird taking flight.
Please fasten your seatbelt, sir. We're about to take off.
Introducing the great new birds of 1970, Pan Am's new Boeing 747, and the great new 1970 Thunderbird, with its daring new grille, executive control panel, and an interior where, as far as luxury goes, the sky's the limit. Thunderbird 1970, completely redesigned for a new decade. Powered by a high-performance 429 V8 engine so smooth, you'll think you're taking off in your own private executive jet. Why drive when you can fly?